I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's interview, I am talking to Dr. Jonathan McLatchie about the historicity of Jesus and the claim of his resurrection. Jonathan is a Christian writer, international speaker, and assistant professor. As well as this, Jonathan has various qualifications, such as a master's degree in evolutionary biology and a second master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience. As mentioned, myself and Jonathan have a conversation about the historicity of Jesus and his acclaimed resurrection. We also discuss Islam's view of Jesus, as well as questioning eyewitness testimony and miracles. I enjoyed this conversation very much. Jonathan clearly has a very in-depth understanding of the Gospels and its historical context behind them. He definitely communicates these ideas very well, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. Make sure that you leave a comment and leave your thoughts on what he said and possible objections or affirmations. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, of course, and remember, maybe most importantly, to share the video to anyone or anywhere where other people might enjoy watching it as well. If you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing if you want more content on philosophy, psychology, literature, theology, and consider also subscribing to my Patreon, where you can essentially get updates from me and bonus content, whilst also helping me grow the channel more and get better equipment if you want to do that little bit extra for the channel to help it flourish on YouTube. Yeah, I hope you enjoy the video, and please leave your thoughts below. Jonathan McLatchie, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me on. How are you doing, James?
I'm doing really good today, thank you. How about you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's really hot here in Boston.
It's really hot here as well in the UK, although it probably isn't. I mean, it's like what, about 25 degrees at the moment, and in the UK it feels far more hot, even though that doesn't sound that much because we don't have air conditioning. So like I'm sure it's nothing to you because yeah, you're living in the comfort of a home with a actual air conditioning unit, whereas I don't. So yeah, it's hot here as well. So I wanted to go straight into it. What convinced you that Christianity is true out of the other religions?
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why I think Christianity is true. And I essentially would have six independent lines of argument for Christianity. So one would be the case for the resurrection, which we can unpack in more detail. I would also argue from the trilemma argument, which was developed originally by C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity. I would also argue from the case for messianic prophecy, ancient prophecies concerning the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. I would also argue from the conversion of the Apostle Paul, which I think is best explained by an actual experience of the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, where Jesus appeared to him and commissioned him to the office of apostleship. I would also argue from contemporary miracles taking place in the world today, which has been documented by Craig Keener, Robert Larmer, Lee Strobel, and others. And I would also argue from the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, in spite of so many attempts through the centuries of stamping out the Jewish people. And yet the Jewish people have retained their national identity across so many centuries in the face of much opposition. Now, it's not necessary for me, of course, to show that each of those arguments individually is sufficient to justify Christian belief. I would argue that certainly taken in aggregate or taken cumulatively, those arguments are sufficient to render the case for Christianity essentially beyond question.
Yeah, so there's a few reasons there, and it is a cumulative argument, overall, I feel, because and even if one is kind of doubted, it doesn't mean the rest falls apart. It just means that it might be kind of put in some jeopardy, but not complete knockdown argument, which I find a lot of atheists are like, well, this side of it is flawed apparently, and then it all falls down. But actually, well, I mean, the only regard in where that's true, I think we both agree in context to Christianity is, of course, the resurrection. That is, which is the topic of today, and the historicity of the Gospels and Jesus. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think the Bible earns its place as a reputable historical text rather than a merely religious text?
Yeah, so the biblical documents, and I'll focus here especially on the Gospels and Acts, which of course pertains to our topic of the resurrection and the crucifixion of Jesus, are, I would argue, they're ancient documents, which everyone, of course, will accept, and they purport to tell the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his sayings and his deeds and so forth, leading up to and culminating in his death by crucifixion and his resurrection from the dead. They purport to be historical reportage or even memoirs of concerning the life of Jesus. For instance, if you read the prologue to the Gospel of Luke, Luke tells us, and I quote, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses, and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. And so Luke is claiming to have received information from eyewitnesses, whether that's from personal interviews that he's done, or perhaps from testimony, written testimony, or oral tradition, perhaps. And we also, when we read the book of Acts, we learn that Luke, from chapter 16 and following, uses the inclusive plural pronoun we, which is taken by many historians to indicate that Luke was himself at least claiming, whether he was or not is another question, but at least claiming to have been a traveling companion of Paul, an eyewitness of the travels of Paul and so forth. Also, the Gospel of John, at the end of the Gospel of John, in chapter 21, the author says concerning the so-called beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And so this is a claim, whether or not he's correct or otherwise is a separate question, but he's at least claiming to be the beloved disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Furthermore, if we go over to 1 John, which everyone essentially agrees was written by the same author as the fourth gospel, he says in the prologue, that which was from the beginning, which we have seen with our eyes. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we're writing these things so that our joy may be complete. And so, again, this seems to be at least the most face value reading of this text, is that the author is claiming to be an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. Now, you might say, well, perhaps he's simply talking about mankind generally as seen and heard and handled and so forth, rather than him being himself a direct eyewitness or acquaintance of Jesus. But notice how he distinguishes in this text between we and you. He says, and that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. And so I tend to think that the most face value reading of this text is correct, that the author is asserting himself to be an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. Now, of course, there's a separate question, which is, are they telling us the truth? Are they actually eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry, or at least receiving information from credible eyewitnesses? Well, we can adduce a number of lines of support for that contention. And there are a number of different categories of evidence that I think bear on the grounding of the Gospels and Acts in credible eyewitness testimony. That is to say, eyewitness testimony of individuals who are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually scrupulous. So an example of a category of evidence that bears, I think, positively on the substantial trustworthiness of the gospel accounts is the feature of what is known as undesigned coincidences. And this was a term that was coined by a Christian philosopher by the name of William Paley, who viewers might be more acquainted with Paley's work in relation to the famous watchmaker analogy in connection to the designoid features of living organisms. But Paley was also a formidable Bible scholar. He wrote a book called Horae Paulinae, which is translated from the Latin title, means the times of Paul. And he pioneered this method of argument known as undesigned coincidences, which is basically where you have two or more accounts concerning an event which overlap and dovetail in a manner that is casual and artless, that is surprising if the account is being fictionalized or if one source is copying from the other or both are copying from a common source. So a few examples to illustrate the point. So in the Gospel of John in chapter 6, we have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And Jesus famously in verse 5, it says, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where would you buy bread so these people may eat? Of course, he's asking this question to test Philip. But you might wonder, Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Why turn to Philip in particular? Why not turn to Judas Iscariot, for example, who was in charge of the money bag or something like that? Why Philip especially? Well, we turn over 6 chapters later to a completely unrelated part of John's Gospel. Chapter 12, this is a different Passover feast, different context. And it mentions that at the feast of Passover, there were some Greeks who wanted to speak to Jesus in verse 21. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And so in this very parenthetical and casual piece of information, we learned that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. Now, if we go over to Luke's account, the parallel of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, this is in chapter 9, Luke does not mention Philip in this context at all, but it does mention in verse 10 that Bethsaida is the setting of the miracle story. It says, on the return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida, and that's where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. And so by putting the pieces together, drawing information from John 6, John 12, and Luke 9, we have a cogent explanation or a complete picture of why Jesus might speak to Philip in John 6:5, because he's a local guy who knows where the shops are to buy bread. And so that sort of feature of the text is that sort of casual and artless dovetailing, where one account incidentally explains or illuminates some natural question raised by another account, I think provides evidence that is confirmatory that we're dealing here with historical reportage. Another related example connecting to the feeding of the 5,000, and of course, by the way, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle aside from Jesus' resurrection, which is actually found across all 4 Gospels. And so there's also an account of this miracle in Mark chapter 6. And in Mark chapter 6, we read in verse 30 and 31, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by ourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." And so this gives you a picture of the hustle and bustle of the place, the busyness of the place. It's so busy, in fact, that they can't find leisure to eat their lunch. So Jesus has them come away by themselves to this deserted area to eat. And then in verse 39, unfortunately for them, of course, the crowds follow Jesus and the disciples. And it says in verse 39 that Jesus commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, the grass in Israel is actually brown throughout the majority of the year, except at a relatively narrow window of time around the spring because of the higher levels of rainfall that coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover. Now, in John's account, John doesn't mention the people coming and going, indicating how busy it is. He also doesn't mention the green grass, but he does mention in verse 4, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And so then that illuminates why it's so busy, because there's all these Jewish pilgrims coming in for the Feast of Passover, and also illuminates the green grass, but does so in such an artless and casual way that it points to historicity. One other example from the Gospels. So if you look at the institution of the Lord's Supper, this is at the Last Supper, the last Passover meal that Jesus has with the disciples. There in Luke's account from verse 24 of Luke 22, we read, a dispute also arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as the one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I among you as the one who serves. Now, so here we learn that at the supper, the Last Supper with Jesus' disciples, there's this debate that arises among the disciples over who is the greater. And Jesus, of course, tells them that, it's the greatest among you must be the one who serves. And he says, I who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is not the one who reclines at table, but I am among you as the one who serves. Now, when we go over to John's account, the parallel of this incident, and we look at chapter chapter 14, chapter 13 rather, we read that verse 2, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist, and he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And so forth. And so he washes the disciples' feet as an object lesson in servanthood. John reports this object lesson in servanthood, but does not report the occasion that gave rise to that object lesson in servanthood. Luke's account reports the occasion that gave rise to it, namely the debate among the disciples over who was the greatest, but not the object lesson itself. And so John's account illuminates Jesus' words in Luke: who's the greater among you, the one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table, but I am among you as the one who serves? So John illuminates and explains and clarifies what Jesus is saying there. And also Luke gives us the occasion that makes sense of why Jesus decides on this particular episode to wash the disciples' feet. So that's just a few examples in the Gospels of undesigned coincidences. Just one quickly in the book of Acts, because the book of Acts has scores and scores of examples of these undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. So, for instance, if we look at 1 Corinthians, which is one of the letters that was written by the Apostle Paul, and we read in verse 17 of chapter 4, it says, "That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." Now, Paul is writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. We know this because he sends greetings from Aquila and Priscilla. And we know from Acts he meets in Corinth and they travel as far as Ephesus. He also makes an allusion to remaining in Ephesus there. So he's writing from Ephesus in Asia Minor, what we now know as Turkey. And he's writing to the Christians in Achaia, what we now know as Greece. And so he says, "That's why I sent you Timothy." So he's speaking in the past tense. At the time of his writing, he's already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. Now, when you get to chapter 16, we read in verse 10, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am." So here he uses the future tense, when Timothy comes. So we'd infer from those little clues in 1 Corinthians that Timothy must have taken some sort of indirect route to Corinth, less direct route to Corinth than the letter itself, because even though he's already sent Timothy on his way at the time of his writing, he nonetheless expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy gets there. And of course, Ephesus and Corinth are across the Aegean Sea from each other. And so the most obvious way to send a letter in those days would be by boat over the Aegean Sea from Ephesus to Corinth. And we'd infer that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia on his way around to Corinth, which would be the less direct way. That's what we predict just from 1 Corinthians. Now, if we go over to Acts 19, verses 21 and 22, we find that's exactly what happens. So this is what concerns when they're in Ephesus. And it says, "After these events, Paul resolved in the spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia," that's where Corinth is, of course, "and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." And so he stays in Asia, in Ephesus, and he sends Timothy along with Erastus, up through Macedonia, exactly as you would predict from those very casual and subtle clues in 1 Corinthians. And in fact, it doesn't even mention that Corinth was the destination of Timothy and Erastus. Notice, though, Timothy's traveling companion is Erastus. Now, who's Erastus? Well, we learn from Romans 16 that Erastus actually happens to be the city treasurer of Corinth, because Romans says that Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you, and everyone agrees that Romans was written from Corinth. And also in 2 Timothy 4, it says Erastus remained at Corinth. There's also an archaeological discovery. There was a pavement slab discovered from the ancient ruins of Corinth, which bears the inscription that Erastus bore the expense of this pavement. So you actually have a minor biblical character there corroborated by archaeology. So it's quite fitting then on his way through Macedonia around to Corinth, he's traveling with a guy who just so happens to be from the region of Corinth. So that's just one category of evidence. We could also talk about extra biblical evidences and so forth. But hopefully that gives at least a beginning of an answer to your question.
Yeah, that was really interesting. A lot of that was new to me, and you explain that very well. I found. It was funny because you mentioned extra biblical evidence. Now, I've been reading some Richard Carrier recently,
Mm.
and and he talks about well, he claims that the extra biblical evidence is pretty poor, if not non-existent. So I want your view on Carrier's perspective there, and the whole claim that the extra biblical accounts are lacking, basically.
Absolutely. So, and by the way, if you want my detailed appraisal of Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, I do have a review of the book that's published on my website. If anyone that's watching this is interested in that discussion. Now, in terms of extra biblical evidences for the New Testament reliability, there are those that pertain to the Gospels, and there are also those that pertain to the Book of Acts. So I'll just give a couple from each. So if we go over to Mark's account and chapter number 6. By the way, there are two ways of adducing extra biblical confirmations of the Gospels. One of which I think is a poor way of doing it, and one of which I think is a good way of doing it. So the poor way of doing it, which unfortunately is the more popular way, is to appeal to texts like the Testimonium Flavianum in Josephus, where there's a paragraph in Antiquities of the Jews, volume 18, where Josephus makes a reference to Jesus. At least most Josephine scholars think that text is at least partially authentic. I actually tend to agree with Carrier that it might actually be a total interpolation, but I'm not dogmatic on that. But in any case, supposing just for the sake of argument that it is partially authentic, it's not really of great evidential value, because Josephus is almost certainly getting his information from Christians. And we already know what Christians in the first century believed about Jesus because we have the New Testament. So it doesn't really add much evidentially to the case. There's also the reference in Tacitus in Annals of Imperial Rome in the 2nd century AD. Tacitus was a Roman historian and member of the Roman Senate. But he quite plausibly got his information from Pliny the Younger, who was interrogating Christians. So I don't think that it really supplies us with independent confirmation besides what we have in the New Testament. So I don't find those modes of reasoning particularly useful. They might have some level of evidential value because they don't express any disagreement with this claim. It doesn't seem that they knew of any contest about whether Jesus existed. So you might be able to make a point there. But it, at best, only helps you to confirm the gospel account in broad outline, which all historians agree with anyway, in terms of there was this guy called Jesus who got himself crucified and had a preaching ministry and so forth. So I tend not to use those texts, but I think that there's a much more sophisticated way of arguing from extra biblical testimony, which is to adduce indirect support, where you have incidental allusions in the biblical accounts, which are corroborated in artless and casual ways by extra biblical sources. So you can think of it essentially as similar to undesigned coincidences, except between the Gospels and an extra biblical secular source. So, for instance, in Mark chapter 6, we read about the imprisonment and death of John the Baptist. And we learn from Mark that the reason why Herod Antipas had John the Baptist imprisoned was because of John the Baptist's complaints about Herod Antipas having married his brother Philip's ex-wife Herodias. And Herod Antipas evidently wasn't very fond of this, and so he has John the Baptist arrested and put in prison, and then he later, of course, gets beheaded. And according to Josephus, so Herod Antipas, of course, had divorced his previous wife in order to marry Herodias. And his previous wife had run home to her father, who happened to be Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. And Aretas, of course, wasn't best pleased about this. And so this results in a war between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. And according to Josephus, first century Jewish historian, Herod actually lost that war against Aretas. His army was destroyed. And Josephus tells us that there was this circulating rumor among the Jewish people that the destruction of Herod's armies came as a judgment from God because of the way that he had treated John the Baptist. Now, Josephus actually gives us a different motivation for why John the Baptist was imprisoned in the first place. He tells us that it was because of Herod's suspicious temper and its fear of an uprising. Now, when you look at the circulating rumor that is written of in Josephus, that the destruction of Herod's armies came from God as a judgment for what he'd done to John the Baptist, that makes perfect sense of what we read in Mark's account, where the reason why Herod had John the Baptist imprisoned was because of John the Baptist's complaints against Herod's adulterous relationship with Herodias, the very adulterous relationship that resulted in that war with Aretas in the first place. And now, of course, the difference in motivation isn't necessarily incompatible. It could be both Herod's suspicious temper and his fear of an uprising and John the Baptist's complaints against his adulterous relationship. But it's interesting that it still raises the question, okay, so how does Mark have this insider knowledge, this inside scoop as to what Herod's motivations were, even when they disagree with those of Josephus? Well, it's interesting, when you look at Luke's account in chapter number 8, we read about certain female disciples that followed Jesus from Galilee. So soon afterwards, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming, bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And so one of Jesus' female disciples that followed him from Galilee was actually married to someone in the highest ranks of Herod's employment, which then provides some plausible explanation for why Mark could come to know what Herod's motivations were for having John the Baptist imprisoned. Another example of extra biblical testimony that supports the biblical account is if we look at Matthew in the Nativity narrative. This is in chapter number 2. We have the episode where Herod the Great, if you recall, who's actually the father of Herod Antipas that we just discussed, he orders the killing of infants in Bethlehem. And so this results in Jesus and Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt. And then, of course, Herod the Great passes away in 4 BC. And it would have been a reasonable inference to draw that following Herod the Great's death, his eldest son is going to take the throne. And so in that knowledge, Joseph and his family are on their way back to Judea. And then something interesting happens on the road. Joseph learns that Archelaus is now reigning in place of his father Herod, and he's afraid to go there. So he decides to go to the region of Galilee instead. Now, this raises 2 interesting questions. Number one, why does he go to Galilee to evade Herod the Great? Herod Archelaus. During Herod the Great's reign, his jurisdiction included both Judea and Galilee. And secondly, why is he so afraid of Herod Archelaus around this time? Well, we learn from Josephus that following Herod the Great's death in 4 BC, Herod's territory was divided among 3 of his sons: Herod Archelaus, his eldest, who reigned in Judea. Galilee was ruled by his younger brother, Herod Antipas. There was also another brother called Philip. And so that explains, first of all, why he goes to Galilee to evade Archelaus. There's a different guy in charge in Galilee, namely Herod Antipas. But why, though, is Joseph so afraid of Archelaus right around this time? Well, we read in Josephus that one of the last things Herod the Great did prior to his death in 4 BC was to have certain Jews executed by being burned to death for their part in removing the Roman eagle from the Jewish temple because of its violation of the second commandment of graven images. And some Jews take it upon themselves to have the eagle removed. And Herod the Great finds out who was responsible, has them brutally put to death. This results in a level of unrest among the Jewish people. And then Herod the Great passes away, and shortly thereafter, the Jewish Passover feast rolls around. And there's this influx of Jewish pilgrims coming in for the feast of Passover. And there's an argument that gets struck up between a group of soldiers and a mob of Jews over what's happened. And this Jewish mob picks up stones, Josephus tells us, and they stone the Roman soldiers to death. And Josephus tells us that they picked up their sacrifices for the Passover and they ran into the Jewish temple. Archelaus was enraged at this threat upon his government, so he rounded up his entire army. He sent his entire army upon the Jewish temple. He surrounded the temple with the horsemen and told them, do not let anyone leave or enter the temple. And then he sent the foot soldiers, the infantry, into the temple. And he told them, kill everyone you find. And so they massacred 3,000 Jews in the Jewish temple. And then he announced to those who were out with the temple in Judea, Passover this year is canceled. Return to your homes. And so you can imagine Joseph on his way back from Egypt, coming into Judea. And who does he meet on the way? This massive fleeing pilgrims coming out of Judea right around this time. He hears what just happened, and he decides to go to Galilee instead. And so there's another example where reading these extra biblical secular sources actually provides you with some backstory as to what's going on. Another example in the Gospels, if you look at John chapter 2, this is where Jesus has just cleansed the temple towards the beginning of his public ministry. And in verses 18 and 19, it says, the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, this is actually part of an undesigned coincidence with Mark, because in Mark 14, 57 and 58, the false witnesses step forward at Jesus' trial before Caiaphas to testify against Jesus. And they say, we heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days we'll build another, but not by human hands. Now, Jesus never actually said that. It's a garbled version of what Jesus says here. He didn't say anything about destroying a man-made temple or rebuilding it in 3 days, but not by human hands. But the reader of Mark is just left hanging. It's an unexplained illusion. And in the context of first century Judea, that's not the sort of thing you want to make jokes about, saying you're going to destroy the temple. Now, when you read John's account, John doesn't report the later twisting of Jesus' words and the later accusation, but he does report the original statement. And so you've got this, again, this undesigned coincidence that corroborates and confirms the historicity of that particular saying. But there's also an extra biblical confirmation here as well. So in verse 20, it says, the Jews then said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? And of course, it turns out he's speaking about the temple of his body and his resurrection from the dead. Now, notice this very specific time reference. It's taken 46 years to build this temple. Now, according to Josephus, when did Herod begin construction work on the temple? Well, according to Josephus, it was the 18th year of his reign, which lands you in 19 BC. Now, what's 46 years on from 19 BC, bearing in mind there's no AD 0, lands you in 28 AD, right? So according to this timestamp, we can infer that this episode is taking place in around 28 AD. Now, if we go over to Luke's account in chapter 3, Luke independently gives us a timestamp for the beginning of Jesus' public ministry when he gets baptized. It's the verse 1, it's the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, when did Tiberius Caesar get to become emperor of Rome? Well, if you read Suetonius in his Life of Tiberius, he tells us that 2 years prior to the death of Augustus dies in 14 AD. So in 12 AD, to ensure the smooth transition of power, Augustus took his son Tiberius to be co-emperor of Rome. And so the 15th year then would be, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius would land you in 27 AD. And the events of which you read in John 1 take place the following Passover, which would land you in 28 AD. So there you have two independent metrics, drawing information from John, Josephus, Josephus and Luke and Suetonius, which allows you to converge upon the same date, which is surprising if this is historical fiction, but not at all surprising if this is actually historical and very reliable reportage. Just a couple examples in the book of Acts quickly. So and there's scores and scores of examples of this in Acts. A good book on this topic I would recommend is Colin Heemer's book, The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History. Craig Keener also has a great 4-volume set on the Book of Acts as well. So in Acts 23, for example, you have Paul apprehended and he's brought before the Jewish council. And it says, verse 1, looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you seeking to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you ordered me to be struck. Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was a high priest. For it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, this raises an interesting question. How come Paul doesn't know who the high priest is at this time? Presumably, he could at least tell by his garb. And when you read Josephus, we actually learn that Ananias, of whom that was spoken, was in truth not the high priest, but he was sitting in judgment in that assumed capacity. He previously held the office. He got deposed in AD 52. He was charged with sedition. He was sent by order of Felix to Rome. and later released, but not reinstated to his office of priesthood. And another was appointed to the station called Jonathan. Jonathan got assassinated, and during the vacancy, there was no one officially occupying the office until Ishmael, son of Fabi. And so during that interval, it seems that Ananias took upon himself by his own authority the discharge of the office, which then illuminates Paul's words. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest. Right, it's a deliberate jab at Ananias, but you don't know that from just reading the text. But the account that we find in Josephus provides some backstory as to what's going on there. Another example in Acts is in Acts 22, Paul is brought before the Roman tribune, and Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful, this is verse 25, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. The tribune answered, I bought the citizenship for a large sum. And Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. And so why does the Roman tribune say there, I bought the citizenship for a large sum? Well, you read in Dio Cassius that there was that during the reign of Claudius brought in a situation where you could actually purchase a Roman citizenship, and it started off extortionately expensive, so that all of the aristocrats would buy their Roman citizenships for a very large sum, and then once he had saturated the market from the aristocrats, he would then reduce the rate so he could saturate the market from the middle class, and then he would once they'd all purchased their Roman citizenships, he would then lower the price again to get money from the lower class citizens. And in fact, Dio Cassius says that it came to be a common saying in those days that because the purchase of a Roman citizenship had become so cheapened, that you could get a Roman citizenship just by bringing the right person some pieces of broken glass. And so then that illuminates the centurion, the tribune's words. I paid a large sum for my citizenship. In other words, how much did you pay, Paul? One final example. So in the accounts of Paul's voyage in Acts 27, you have the account of a shipwreck, and we read that the prisoners get transferred by a Roman centurion to an Alexandrian grain ship, and they end up in Crete. And there's a lot of evidence bearing on the credibility of Paul's voyage in Acts 27. If you want a good book on this, I recommend James Smith's book, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. So they're, according to Acts 27, they're trying to traverse the island, going from one end of the island to the other along the shoreline. But there's a tempestuous wind that comes down. It says in verse 13 and 14 that it sailed along Crete close to the shore, but soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Now, there is actually a well-confirmed wind that rides over Crete from the northeast, and is actually strongest at this exact time near the Passover. So that's an interesting confirmation. It also tells us in verse 16 that as a result of this wind, it says, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now, what's impressive is that the Isle of Cauda that's referenced there is actually more than 20 miles west-southwest of where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Massara. And that's precisely where the trajectory of a northeaster should have carried them. And it's not the sort of information someone would have inferred without having been blown there. And ancients actually found it nearly impossible to properly locate islands that far out. In fact, Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke today, and both contradict Luke, but it's Luke's report alone that actually gets the implied location of the island correct. So Colin Hemer, in his book, the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, he says that, and I quote, he says, in the places where we can compare, Luke fares much better than the encyclopedist Pliny. It might be regarded as the foremost first century example of such a source. Pliny places Cauda opposite Hieripna, some 90 miles too far east. Even Ptolemy, who offers a reckoning of latitude and longitude, makes a serious dislocation to the northwest, putting Cauda too near the western end of Crete in a position which would not suit the unstudied narrative of our text. And so we have another example there of an extra biblical corroboration where something is corroborated that the authors of the Gospels and Acts couldn't possibly know what we'd be able to cross-check through archaeological and documentary evidence. Well, one very final example in Acts so in Acts 16, verse 14, it mentions that Lydia, a seller of purple dye or fabric is from Thyatira, which is a city which we find in Asia Minor. And that city, it turns out, was in fact a center of the trade in purple dye. Remember the stock of common knowledge was much less at that time. So it's important not to anachronistically think that the ancients would have access to Google and Wikipedia and could just look things up in order to include them in their account. And so the accuracy of Acts and indeed the Gospels on very, very minor and very specific details is, I think, quite confirmatory that they are individuals who are well informed and close up to the facts.
Yeah, that was a lot of detail and a good amount of examples, and it really does strike me, as you say, as you offered the information, that clearly at the time they weren't playing around with the current events. Like, they weren't just being flippant about what was occurring, and they were actually, in terms of the historicity of what was occurring at the time, it's fairly admirable that we can actually know as much as that from the time, because I find that there's a kind of a misconception that we can't know anything from like 2,000 years ago or something, and that's I've encountered that kind of idea quite a lot. And I'm no historian. I'm actually a kind of reader of books that might be about history, because I enjoy the topic, and also because of it, it relates to religion as well, i.e., Christianity especially. But there is this idea, isn't there, in some debates, where there's this kind of radical skepticism, and I get the impression from you that clearly you've just laid out a series of things that demonstrate the opposite, that there is this good amount of sources and independent as well, like secular or not. So back to Carrier, because he also, of course, claims that Jesus did not exist in terms of probability. He claims in the Historicity of Jesus that it's a 1 in 3 chance. I am very interested to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, so his argument, as far as I'm concerned, is a bit of a train wreck. I don't find his interpretation of the Pauline corpus to be at all convincing. Carrier essentially thinks that the Apostle Paul believed that Jesus did not exist on earth, but rather was crucified in outer space by demons underneath the moon. And I find his interpretation of the Pauline corpus to be absolutely laughable. I've written a very detailed review of his arguments there. Carrier actually has responded to my review. I'm intending to write a response at some point. I haven't got around to it yet. I didn't find his response very convincing. But if you want my detailed review, which is of his interaction with the Pauline corpus, I would recommend my review on my website. I think that Carrier's case, though, is very much undermined by the sorts of evidences that I've been adducing already from the Gospels and Acts. If Acts, as I maintain, really was composed by someone who was a traveling companion of Paul, that really undermines Carrier's thesis in any case, because it would be very surprising, because Luke clearly believed that Jesus lived on earth. It would be very surprising if Paul's traveling companion, Luke, had such a radically different perspective on who Jesus was from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, because what Carrier what Carrier also discusses is the fact that, in context of Jesus as a man, he criticizes it insofar as, look, we have Alexander the Great, we have coins with his face on it, right? And he makes the case that, I know we've talked about extra biblical sources before, but that was in context specifically to the New Testament as a whole. But in context to Jesus as a man, what do you what's your response to the carrier view that, hey, look, Alexander the Great, you can't really compare them because he's got we have extra biblical, independent sources and information, and the coin thing, we found numerous coins with actually his face on it and engravings, and Carrier claims that there's just nothing of that sort of Jesus, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yes, this is a common fallacy where one says, well, the evidence for hypothesis X should be better than it is. We could have even more evidence. Therefore, we don't have sufficient evidence to conclude that hypothesis X is correct. And for any proposition, you could come up with a situation where you'd have even more evidence for it. But that is not to say that you don't have sufficient evidence. And I think the evidence we do have is already far more than sufficient to conclude that Jesus of Nazareth existed as an historical figure. I mean, I don't know how you make sense of the numerous independent and varied lines of evidences that we have for strong gospel reliability on the supposition that Jesus never existed. For instance, on top of the undesigned coincidences and extra biblical corroboration is just another category of evidence which also helps to confirm strong gospel reliability is the feature of unexplained allusions in the Gospels. So an unexplained allusion is where you have, it's best explained by giving an example. So here's an example. So Mark 15:21, it says, this is when Jesus is carrying his cross to his execution site. It says, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now, who are Alexander and Rufus? They're just name dropped, like we're supposed to know who they are. Now, clearly, or evidently, presumably, they are individuals who are known to the early Christian community, the original readers of Mark. That's why they're just name dropped, like we're supposed to know who they are. And they don't play any further role in the story, either in the Gospels or in the book of Acts. We don't know who they are, but the original audience presumably did. Now, if you're making up a story, and this is not grounded in fact at all, why name drop individuals that anchor these events to real people that your audience are familiar with? That's something that is very surprising for one to do. If you're making up a story, you try to minimize unnecessary details. And when one brings up those sorts of considerations to Carrier, comes out with the most far-fetched explanations to try and make the data fit. And sure, you can make the data fit any hypothesis if you try hard enough. That's essentially how young Earth creationism works, right? Is just make the data fit, find a way of getting it to work by invoking enough auxiliary hypotheses. Now, you can certainly do that with Jesus mythicism as well, or you could do what I think is the more reasonable and more rational thing, which is to favor the hypothesis that labors under the fewest auxiliary hypotheses. And I think that the explanation that these features of the text exist because we're dealing with real historical events is the simplest, the most parsimonious, the most face value reading of the data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm interested in you kind of I don't know, briefly outlining your response to Carrier's book, and the point, some of the points that he made. I'd be interested in you sharing that.
As I said before, Carrier believes that the Apostle Paul thought that Jesus was Jesus was crucified in outer space below the moon by demons. And I think that there's a overwhelming case within the Pauline corpus that discounts that idea. And that's wholly apart from the considerations that already elaborated. The Gospels and Acts appear to be substantially reliable. I think that Carrier is just out to lunch on his analysis, not only of the Pauline corpus, but also his analysis of the Gospels and Acts. And I actually interact with some of his material regarding the book of Acts in my review of his book. So I'd refer readers to that for more information, further discussion of that. Now, what about the Pauline corpus, though? So in Galatians 4, verse 4, Paul writes, and I quote, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, born under the law," right? And so that seems to indicate that Jesus really was, in fact, born of a woman. Now, what does Carrier do with this? Well, he connects that verse to verse 24, where Paul said, Paul says, and I quote, "Now this might be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar." So Carrier argues that Galatians 4:4 is really only saying that Jesus was born of a covenant, not of a literal woman. But this, I think, is a very strange interpretation, because Paul only introduces the allegory in verse 21 of Galatians 4, 17 verses after verse 4. In Galatians 4:24, Paul is only indicating that he's about to show an allegorical understanding of the narrative that he's just made reference to in the book of Genesis concerning the births of Ishmael and Isaac. The whole purpose of the allegorical interpretation of the two women is to show the true significance of Jesus' birth, given that Jesus traces his lineage back to Isaac, which is the child born through trust in the promises of God, and he was born of the free woman Sarah in Galatians 4:23. There is another text that that sometimes comes up in connection with demonstrating that Paul actually believed in an historical figure is Romans 1 verse 3, which I also think is pretty conclusive. So Paul writes in the prologue of his epistle to the Romans, and I quote, "Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning the Son who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh." Now, what does Carrier argue? So he argues that although the verb Paul uses here, ginome, is used of birth by other authors, it's not the word that Paul customarily uses for birth, which is genao. And Carrier argues that ginome is used of God's manufacture of Adam's body from clay and God's manufacture of our glorified bodies in heaven. So Carrier argues that this is a strange word for Paul to use if he simply means to indicate that Jesus was born. So Carrier thinks that or his interpretation of Romans 1 verse 3 is that God manufactured Jesus out of sperm that was obtained from David's belly, and Carrier suggests that this event took place in outer space. So he has in mind the Genesis 2 verse 7 in the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, in which the word egeneto, which is the aorist indicative form of ginome, appears, describing the man as becoming a living creature. But the word that's used to describe the moment of divine manufacture in that text is egeneto. It's not egeneto, but it's rather eplasen, which is the third person aorist indicative of the verb plaso. So the word egeneto rather is used in this context to describe the change of state from non-living to living. So it's not precisely correct to say that egeneto refers to divine manufacture. And Paul himself, in fact, alludes to that text in 1 Corinthians 15:45. So while Carrier asserts and claims that Paul does not use ginome to refer to a human birth, that only begs the question, since he has to assume that Romans 1 verse 3 and also Galatians 4 verse 4, which says that Jesus was born using the word genomenon of a woman and born under the law, are not using the verb in that sense, which is a very question he's attempting to address. And moreover, according to Liddell and Scott's Intermediate Greek Lexicon, the verb ginome in the context of persons means to be born. And we can independently verify this to be the case by analyzing instances where that verb is used in the Septuagint in order to discern how that word is used in relation to persons. So Genesis 21 verse 3, for instance, says, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. In the Greek Septuagint, the Hebrew word was born is translated genomenu. Another example is Genesis 46:27, where it says, and the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were two. Now, again, the Greek Septuagint renders this as genomenu. And finally, in Genesis 48 verse 5, it says, now your two sons who are born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. So here, once again, the Greek Septuagint uses the word genomenu. So Kierkegaard argues, he observes that Paul also uses another verb, genao, to refer to being born. One instance is in Romans 9, verse 11, where it says that though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. The other instance is Galatians 4, 23 and 29, where it says that, but the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. But just as at verse 29, but just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the spirit, so also it is now. Now, it can be granted that Paul uses the verb genao to refer to being born, but that doesn't entail anything more than Paul was willing to use synonyms for a word that carry the same meaning. Another relevant question here is how Paul himself used the word spermatos, which is usually translated as seed or offspring elsewhere. So Paul writes in Romans 11, verse 1, I ask then, has God rejected this people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant, spermatos, of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul uses the exact same word for descendant as he used in Romans 1, verse 3 to describe Jesus as being a descendant of David. So if Paul believed, which he presumably did, that his descendants from Abraham entailed that he himself existed on earth, then it stands to reason that he also believed that Jesus existed on earth by virtue of his descendants from David. So also, it's important to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls, that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there was an expectation of a Davidic Messiah, and that's also quite evident from the Hebrew Bible as well. And so the interpretation that Paul intends to express that Christ was born of the line of David is much more plausible antecedently than Kierkegaard's thesis that it refers to some sort of divine manufacture. So as I said before, I think that Kierkegaard is just trying to make the data fit and trying to come up with a hypothesis that is able to account for this data, which seems to point to an historical Jesus, and it's very, very ad hoc and far-fetched. I think the far simpler explanation is just to postulate that Jesus was a real historical figure. At least that's what Paul thought, and Paul's belief that Jesus was an historical figure, given how close up he is to people who are eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, is itself a compelling reason to think that Jesus existed. I mean, Paul knew, he was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, as well as Jesus' brother, James. We know that from Galatians 1 and elsewhere.
Yeah, Carrier's thesis is definitely quite a dramatic one, and it's funny because when I kind of put it on my Instagram that I was reading it, I had a lot of responses, sort of saying, "Look, why are you reading Carrier? He's a bit of a joke." And regardless of, I found it important because before reading, I knew of his reputation. I've heard arguments against his thesis, but I think that it is really important to read Carrier and individuals like this who do point to a question that should be considered, of course, but because I'm a firm believer in actually reading a text for yourself and actually coming to your own conclusions, and the problem with that obviously is that it's quite long quite often. And thankfully, though, with Nietzsche, one of my favorite authors, it's actually a very fun time reading him because he's just so dramatic, and his language is lyrical. And I must say, Rick Carrier's book was quite difficult to get through. I can't admit to finishing it all because of its density, and I have to give him that. Like it seemed to me that he did take the hypothesis quite seriously. Did you get that impression from him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have no reason to doubt his sincerity. I think that that's his sincere conclusions. I think that I think that he overlooks some problems with his thesis, and I also think that he underestimates the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts as well. So yeah, I have criticisms both of his interpretation of the Pauline corpus as well as his engagement with the Gospels and Acts as well.
Yeah. So regarding the resurrection, which is a whole nother uh, ball game than the historicity of Jesus, because of course many do believe probabilistically that Jesus did exist. It's would you say the consensus? So the resurrection, could you go through, as because it is obviously there's quite a lot to it, the arguments for the resurrection and the context behind it, but could you give a brief overview of your argument for the resurrection, and then we can kind of go from there?
Sure. So I'll start by contrasting my approach to the resurrection from what your viewers might already be familiar with, which is the so-called minimal facts approach, which was developed and championed by people like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona calls it calls the bedrock, historical bedrock. And I have some significant concerns about the minimal facts approach. Basically, for those that aren't familiar with it, the minimal facts approach basically argues that, or basically attempts to limit the data set that's used to demonstrate the resurrection to those facts which enjoy strong evidential support and also enjoy scholarly consensus from more than 90% of contemporary scholars across the theological spectrum. And also the minimal facts approach has a tendency to lean very heavily on the Pauline corpus, particularly the oral creedal tradition that we find in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. And I have a number of concerns about the minimal facts approach. For one thing, when Habermas, who of course pioneered the minimal facts approach, is pressed on the alternative explanation for the appearances, because appearances is a minimal fact by his criteria, if you define it broadly enough. But when he's challenged on some sort of alternative explanation, such as the mass hallucination hypothesis, some sort of objective vision, something along those lines, his rejoinder is typically to appeal to the implausibility of mass hallucinatory experiences or shared group hallucinatory experiences. The problem, though, is that that's no longer qualifying as a minimal fact by Habermas's criteria, because the group appearances is not recognized by more than 90% of historical scholars. And so Habermas essentially has to change his criteria midway through the argument without disclosing this to his audience. And so this is a little bit of a bait and switch problem. I'm also not convinced that one can repose the entire weight of one's case on 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, as people like Habermas have a tendency to do. I think that Habermas grossly over-exaggerates how early you can justify dating the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Habermas wants to put it within a year or two of Jesus' crucifixion. We just don't have good reason to think that's the case. It might be the case, but we don't have good reason to think that. Habermas wants to say that Paul likely received this oral creed when Paul met with Peter and James, that we read of in Galatians 1, the very people mentioned in that creed, and he may well have got it from them at that time, but we don't know that. And I also, there are a number of different types of appearances that are consistent with the appearance claim broadly construed. You have, for instance, a non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus that floats above the ground, or one who appears very briefly for a few moments and says all is well or something and then vanishes. And some of those appearances actually might be disconfirmatory of the hypothesis of a bodily resurrection. If you imagine like a floating Jesus and you try to touch him and your hand goes right through him, for example, that would be disconfirmatory of a bodily resurrection. So I'm not convinced that you can limit yourself to the minimal facts data set and still justify strongly the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. If we can't say what the experiences were like, and I'm not convinced that you can do that simply from the Pauline corpus, if you can't say what the experiences were like, then it's very difficult to adjudicate or assess the rationality of the disciples' belief that the best explanation for what they saw is that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. So I prefer an alternative approach to making the case for the resurrection, which is what has come to be called the maximal data approach. And that term was coined by my colleague, Dr. Lydia McGrew. And the maximal data approach essentially asserts up front that, and argues for, that what we have in the Gospels in Acts reflects the testimony of those who are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually scrupulous. That being the case, then we have, and I've already adduced kind of an evidence sampler and how I'd go about making that sort of argument. If that is the case, then we have a justification for thinking that the accounts in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus actually reflects what was being asserted by those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Because if the Gospels and Acts are indeed composed by individuals who are close up to the facts and well-informed, then it stands to reason that the accounts concerning the resurrection actually were reflective of eyewitness testimony. Now, when anyone makes any sort of testimonial claim, whether that be sexual assault allegation or witness to a miracle, whatever it happens to be, there are three and only three broad explanatory categories that could purport to account for and explain why they made the claim. One is that they lied about it, one is that they're honestly mistaken, and one is that they're actually correct, or a combination thereof. Now, when we look at the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters that we find in the Gospels and Acts, we find that they are not merely individual sightings from a distance and very briefly or something like that, but they are multi-sensory. They involve multiple sensory modes, not just individual sightings, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, like the Emmaus disciples, for instance, physical contact with Jesus, eating with Jesus more than one occasion. In Luke 24, you've got Jesus eating broiled fish in their presence. In John 21, you have Jesus eating breakfast with the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and so forth. Physical contact with Jesus, according to Acts chapter 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period. So it wasn't just a brief and confusing episode. And it's a sort of set of testimonial claims it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. Another line of evidence that also argues against them being honestly mistaken is the fact that according to all four Gospels, Jesus' resurrection is on the Sunday, the first day of the week, the Lord's Day. And this appears to be a very early belief. I mean, the Christians actually changed their sacred day from Sabbath observance to Lord's Day observance, the first day of the week. And actually, if you read the early church fathers, we learn that the reason why they changed their sacred day from the Sabbath to the Lord's Day, or the Sunday, was because that's the day they believed Jesus was raised from the dead. There's actually no competing tradition in the early church. And all four Gospels independently say that Jesus was raised on the Lord's Day, on the first day of the week. And you find references to Lord's Day gathering very early sources, including Paul, Book of Acts, Book of Revelation, and so on, and not to mention the early church fathers. Now, that's striking because Paul makes the point in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus is the first fruits from among those who have fallen asleep, from among the dead. In other words, he is the first to be raised to glory and immortality ahead of the general resurrection at the end of the world. He is the guarantor, if you will, of the rest of the resurrection to come. Now, of course, that is presented as a fulfillment of the first fruits feast, because in Leviticus 23, you have the Feast of First Fruits, which is celebrating the first day of the harvest, the guarantor that the remainder of the harvest is to be delivered. And that was, according to Leviticus 23, to be celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath, following the Passover, which would make it the Sunday. And so it's striking then that Jesus' resurrection purportedly happens on the day following the first Sabbath, following the Passover, namely the Sunday. Given the theological import of that, with Jesus being the first fruits from among the dead, that points to design, away from the honest mistaken hypothesis. It could be design either on the part of the human authors or on the part of God, raising Jesus from the dead on that special day in order to make a theological point. But it does point away from the hypothesis that they were honest and mistaken. So then, having reduced very drastically the probability of the hypothesis that the disciples were honest and mistaken, we then redistribute the probabilities between two remaining explanations for why the disciples claimed what they did. Either Jesus, in fact, was raised from the dead, or they lied about it deliberately. And when we look at the Book of Acts and the letters of Paul and other sources like Clement of Rome, for instance, towards the end of the first century, we discover that the early apostles were willing to voluntarily undergo labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions and sufferings, and in some cases martyrdom, on account of their testimony that Christ was raised from the dead. In other words, they went against their own self-interests and the interests of their own self-preservation and so forth. Now, when life or liberty are at stake, multi-party conspiracies tend to break down. The fact that you have these multiple purported witnesses who are willing to suffer persecution and in some cases martyrdom on account of their testimony goes a long way towards establishing their sincerity. Furthermore, you've got the use of in all four Gospels, apparently independently, of women as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. And given the patriarchal society that was ancient Palestine, where the testimony of a woman was worth a fraction of that of a male witness, that also tends to suggest that the reason that they included what was for them that awkward and embarrassing fact of women being the chief discoverers of the empty tomb was because that really was what happened. And in any case, why involve the women at all? I mean, you're involving additional parties that could potentially blow your conspiracy, especially when you factor in that involving the women is going to involve, in addition, other influences on the women outside of the apostles' control, such as their husbands and things like that. So the conspiracy hypothesis also doesn't seem to make sense to me. And so if the hypothesis that the apostles lied is extremely improbable, and the hypothesis they were honestly mistaken is extremely improbable, and if I'm correct, the Gospels and Acts actually do reflect what the apostles were claiming, then in my judgment, the best explanation of the relevant data is that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. And so that's the position that I take. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, there's a few things, aren't the women making that discovery. And you know, I used to, I don't know, maybe I still hold this view to some extent, but eyewitness testimony. I mean, I do psychology at university. I'm going back in September, so a couple of months now, and I'm very skeptical of eyewitness testimony. The most famous case is the Loftus one, where there's a simulated car crash, and they go and interview the onlookers of different different groups, and one group they use different language and the other one they use different language, and one they say smash, and then the other one they say crash, and then the people of the crash report that, oh well, it must have been far more fatal, whereas the smash, it's like, oh well, maybe it wasn't, right? So based off of that, and the psychology of how people come to believe what happened during events, especially if they're traumatic, I'm naturally quite skeptical against eyewitness testimonies. What would you say to that skepticism? How can, I know that you've gone to it a bit there, but what's your response to that? Like, we can't trust eyewitness testimonies.
Yeah, that's a good question, and this comes up quite often. And there have been studies that have been done on the reliability of eyewitness testimony. And you're right that eyewitness testimony is typically not seen as particularly reliable in a court of law. In cases where, and studies have shown that eyewitness testimony has a tendency to be unreliable when certain criteria are met. Namely, when the participants are strangers to one another, when there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun, because your attention tends to focus on the weapon, rather because you want to stay alive a bit longer, so you tend to miss certain details, and when events happen very quickly over a period of seconds or minutes. Whereas when we're looking at the resurrection encounters that are reported by the Gospels, we see that, by contrast, the experiences are multisensory, polymodal, involving multiple sensory modes. They're over a long period of time, 40 days. My colleague Tim McGrew likes to ask this question. So think of a time when you were in high school, perhaps, and you had a close friend that you used to hang out with in high school. Now think of a particular day when you were hanging out with that friend. Now, can you testify under oath that that was indeed your friend, not someone else, and that they were in fact alive and not dead? Well, if so, then you are as qualified as the apostles to testify whether in fact it was Jesus that they were hanging out with purportedly for 40 years and having breakfast with and having long discourses with and so forth. And so I don't think that that objection is particularly strong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and especially as the fact that there were, there was a mass amount of people who were also there at the time. It's not like one person saw him or even two or
Right.
three. Quite a lot of witnesses were around for, not only his life, of course, but the resurrection itself. And you did mention the hallucination theory, and I must say that I find it entirely unconvincing, as you do, that that it must have been some huge mass hallucination, because they are very rare, to begin with. I mean, that barely happens at all. Although I don't know, I'd say in general, maybe I just have this default of being skeptical of historical evidence to some extent, because it's one thing saying that Alexander the Great didn't exist, right? And that he didn't conquer and all this sort of thing. And it's another thing to say that a man resurrected from the dead. I mean, one of them is grounded in material reality, and then the other claim is quite literally grounded in the immaterial, and it's something that we don't observe every day, basically. And so I don't know, is this comparison one to think about? Like, is it something that do you have any thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah.
we should kind of change the metric and how we think about something because of the resurrection being a transcendent claim by definition, whereas Alexander the Great existing, for example, that's one that kind of, oh yeah, we can shrug and be like, yeah, okay, but because this is a resurrection, it's something that we don't see every day. It's something extraordinary by definition. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is essentially David Hume's concern about the ability to justify belief in miracles. And basically, what you're saying is, and this is a very common objection, but Bergman champions this objection, for instance. Carl Sagan, of course, famously said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But these ideas essentially all go back to David Hume. And what basically the argument amounts to is that a miracle, by definition, is the least probable explanation. Because if it wasn't an incredibly improbable explanation, then it wouldn't be a miracle. And so an historian can never infer a miracle as the best or most probable explanation, because a miracle by definition has got to be at the bottom of the barrel, right? So even if the mass hallucination hypothesis or some other hypothesis is extremely implausible, it's still got to be more plausible than the hypothesis that a decaying corpse was revived and came back to life again. And there's a number of things I would say there. First of all, I don't think that a frequentist model of assessing the intrinsic probability of the resurrection is the way to go. And here's why. If God has used miracles in history as authenticating signs, which is the claim both of the Old and New Testament, that miracles are wrought not just as a magic show, but to authenticate a messenger, whether that be an apostle or Jesus himself or a prophet, something like that. Now, for miracles to function as signs in that way, they have to recognizably deviate from the normal course of nature, the way nature normally behaves. If they didn't, they would be robbed of their evidential value. And so the hypothesis that we're investigating here actually predicts with a high level of probability that you will in fact find that miracles recognizably deviate from the normal course of nature. So the fact they do in fact deviate from the normal course of nature can't be taken as a serious blow to the hypothesis that predicts that very thing. So that's one consideration. There are also plenty of examples where we might have reason to think something is plausible, even if it is an event that we've never observed before. So, for instance, Tim McGrew gives this example, which I think is good, which is that according to some theories of nuclear physics, protons can spontaneously decay. But this happens so rarely that it's never been observed. But there are theoretical physicists who would argue that there's a theoretical basis for thinking that proton spontaneous decay occurs. And so scientists have built these underwater tanks deep in the ground to try and detect this spontaneous proton decay, even though it's never been observed, but we have a theoretical basis for thinking that it's plausible. And so likewise with the resurrection, I would argue that, yeah, it's predicted that it's not going to be something that we regularly observe. Otherwise, it's not going to serve much evidential value in authenticating Jesus' messianic credentials. However, there are independent considerations that bear on Jesus' messianic and divine status, which provides some independent reason to believe that God plausibly might have motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead, such that even if we grant, and I think this is true, that the intrinsic probability of God raising any miscellaneous Joe Blow from the dead is astronomically small. God doesn't seem to be in the business of raising people from the dead. It doesn't necessarily follow from that the intrinsic probability in Jesus' case is equivalently low. So, for instance, I would bring to bear the trilemma argument, the argument for messianic prophecy, and so forth. So the trilemma argument in brief is that we have strong historiographical evidence, we can talk about if you want, that indicates and confirms that Jesus actually claimed divine status. He claimed to be the God of Israel incarnate. That being the case, then one of two things is true. Either he was right or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, either we knew he wasn't who he claimed to be, or he didn't. And the fact that Jesus was willing to get himself crucified on account of that testimony goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere. And there's a very small reference class of individuals that can be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate, and Jesus doesn't seem to fit that reference class. And so, it might not be sufficient on its own to establish Jesus' identity, but it does tend to move the needle in that direction. Another argument would be the argument for messianic prophecy, which is, so an example of that would be, so Isaiah 53, verses 1 and 2 tell us that the Messiah was supposed to be rejected by his own people. And yet, according to Isaiah 42, verse 6, and Isaiah 49, verse 6, the Messiah was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, that God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And so, who except Jesus has brought, in spite of being rejected by his own people, the Jews, has nonetheless brought representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel? Well, no one has. And so, again, not sufficient on its own to establish Christianity, but it does tend to move the needle. That observation is much more expected if Christianity is true than if it were false. Another example is Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, which I think is well supported by evidence, which we can talk about. And we already gave one example relating to an extra-biblical corroboration of the nativity accounts. Now, if Jesus really was born in Bethlehem, again, not sufficient to show that Christianity is true, but it's highly probable that if he's the Messiah, that he would be born in Bethlehem, but not especially probable on the falsity of that hypothesis. Another example would be the fact that Jesus' death coincides with the Feast of Passover, given the theological import of that. That's very well supported historically, that Jesus died at Passover on Nisan 15th. That being the case, that's striking because of the theological import of that. The Passover was relates to the last of the 10 plagues of Egypt, where the angel of death would come and smite the firstborn of every Egyptian household. But the Hebrew households had the blood of a lamb smeared on their doorposts, so the angel of death, when he saw that, would pass over those homes, leaving the firstborn unscathed. And so Christ, of course, becomes the fulfillment of that Passover imagery. And so it's quite striking then his death coincides with the Feast of Passover on that very day, on Nisan 15th, which is when the day of Passover is celebrated. So that's striking, not sufficient on its own, but it does again tend to move the needle. Then you've also got the argument from contemporary miracles, which I think is also compelling, taken in cumulatively. Not all cases of reported contemporary miracles are equally well documented or equally credible, but there's enough in there that is, in my judgment, credible that makes me think there's something to it. Also, the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds also bears favorably on the existence, the reality of the God of Israel, and so forth. So when you take all of those independent considerations, that provides you with some reason to think that, yeah, there's a theohistorical context here that supports that God plausibly might have reason to raise Jesus specifically from the dead. And therefore, the resurrection hypothesis should be an explanation that's on the table for contention and for consideration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds yeah, it's definitely a cumulative case,
Mm.
for sure. But I would say most knowledge is down to cumulative speculation and a hypothesis and study, and evidence coming together to come to this probabilistic conclusion. Because I'm one to definitely believe that what we understand about reality and what we take for granted is down to probabilistic hypothesis and things like that. Certainty is not within our grasp necessarily. I'm wondering I don't know if you've seen, and I don't think it's original to Matt Dillahunty, but have you seen the Unbelievable, Premier Unbelievable with Justin Briley debate when I can't remember, I think it's Glenn, but it was Matt and Glenn, and Matt Dillahunty says, why did Jesus sacrifice himself to himself for a weekend? I'm wondering what you think about that. What you think about that claim?
Yeah, so that I think betrays a misunderstanding about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. We don't believe that Jesus sent himself and Jesus sacrificed himself to himself, and that's just not a Christian understanding. The Christian understanding is that God is one; He's complex in His unity, but there's three persons that make up that divine essence, that divine being, three co-equal, co-eternal divine persons, namely the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the Father sends the Son is voluntarily sacrificed to the Father on behalf of the sins of the world. The Father sends the Son, and the Son voluntarily breaks into human history and lives a perfect life and obeys all of the requirements of the law, and then finally goes to the cross and dies on the cross. And he is raised on the third day. But it's the sufferings of Christ. When Christ was suffering on that cross at Calvary, it wasn't merely the physical sufferings of Christ that availed to atone for our sins, but it was the fact that he was enduring the wrath and judgment of a holy God on behalf of mankind, that we had violated God's law, and Jesus paid our penalty with his own life's blood. And so there's more to it than just simply the physical sufferings of Christ. And so God decided that the penalty that Christ endured would be sufficient to satisfy both his justice, because God is holy, he's just, and he must come against sin with perfect righteousness, or he's no longer perfectly just. But then, of course, that conflicts with his love. God is love, God is compassion. So how do those come together? Well, they come together in the person of Christ, who satisfies God's justice, because he is being a fully divine person, and taking upon himself a human nature. He is qualified to endure the wrath of God in our stead, such that there's no condemnation, as Romans 8 verse 1 says, for those who are in Christ Jesus, because Christ has consumed he's drunk the cup of divine fury right down to the very last drop, which is why when he cries out on the cross, tetelestai, or it is accomplished, it's as though he turns over that cup and not one drop falls out, because he's consumed it right down to the very dregs. So that's the Christian perspective on Christ's death, or at least that's the mainstream penal substitution view of what's going on in the atonement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's a question that I have as well, which is, why did this just have to happen in the first place? Why did Jesus even have to come to us, allegedly, and sacrifice himself for us? I mean, as far as God's perspective goes, why wasn't the implications of Jesus's sacrifice already there from the beginning? Why did it have to, why did the whole drama have to happen in the first place?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll say there. First of all, even supposing that we don't have a complete answer to that question, that is, I would argue, only a question rather than an objection per se. So I encourage people to distinguish between questions and objections. Questions, of course, can express objections, but for a question to become an objection, you need an additional premise, either that we do know the answer and that entails some sort of internal inconsistency or is answered with empirical evidence, or that we don't know the answer and the Christianity we're true, we should expect to know the answer. So, and of course, we all have unanswered questions. There are plenty, whatever worldview one adopts, there's going to be unanswered questions. The question is it an objection? And I don't think, even if we couldn't supply a fully satisfying answer to that question, I don't think that that would be a reason to reject Christianity if the evidence justifies that Christianity is true and we just can't understand certain things. But as to the Christian perspective and why Jesus had to die, as I said before, the gospel begins with God's holiness, his righteousness, his justice. And because God is perfectly holy, he must come against sin with perfect justice and perfect righteousness. He can't just turn a blind eye to sin. But then he also is perfectly loving and merciful. And so those attributes of God come together in the cross of Christ, that Christ fully satisfied the just requirements of God in order that we could be pardoned before a just and holy God, and therefore legally acquitted before him, and so that we could enter into eternal fellowship with God. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So enter into eternal fellowship of God. So that is, so it's kind of setting up this guarantee that there will be kind of like a sense of replenishment and hope in the after, and it was this kind of message being delivered that this would occur and you're not kind of left alone. And William Lane Craig makes a really interesting argument. He actually posited this. I learned it from him in his debate with Christopher Hitchens all those years ago. And he said, because Hitchens was like, well, why did it take so long for Jesus to come? And then William Lane Craig kind of turned around and he said, well, he said, there have been studies, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, whether you're aware of this, what you think of it. There are studies that demonstrate that actually, in terms of population growth, the time of Jesus coming to Earth and delivering his message was ideal in terms of the world population and how it grew exponentially after that. And I found that to be a really, really interesting take on the question, because for a while I was like, yeah, why now? Why at that point? It just seemed very abrupt and random, and the fact that people were living paganism, for example, people were living, as far as Christianity is concerned, a misguided life, and that was a really interesting argument against that objection. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, we can never know for sure exactly why God chose that particular time. We're engaging, of course, in speculative theology at this point. I mean, God certainly had dealings with people well before Jesus came. Certainly, we have a record of his dealings with the Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible, and we also, of course, have some record of his dealings with other non-Jewish people. For example, Jonah is sent as a prophet to the Assyrians, for instance, the Assyrian city of Nineveh. You've got individuals like Rahab, the prostitute, who was a Canaanite, who was brought into the people of God, even though she was a Gentile, and so forth. So you have the Moses goes when he leaves Egypt, he meets a group of Midianites, right, who are God-fearers. So I think there's evidence in Scripture that God had dealings with even non-Jewish people, and we don't necessarily have a record of all of those dealings with the non-Jewish people. But not knowing what God's arrangements were and what his dealings were with the non-Jewish people, I think that it's difficult to make an argument or an objection to Christianity or to the Bible on the basis of the question of what God's dealings might have been, or why we only have primarily only have a record of his dealings with the Jewish people. As to the question of why Jesus came when he did, I think that's a plausible answer that William Lane Craig gave, perhaps part of the answer. But at the end of the day, again, I think that's only a question that we can ask. I don't think it's necessarily an objection, unless you can show either that we do know it entails some sort of internal inconsistency, or that we don't know and we should expect to if Christianity were true.
Okay, yeah, thanks for giving your thoughts on that. I was interested to hear what you say in response. So Islam,
Mm,
Now, Islam has a very interesting view of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection,
mm.
and although they don't negate him entirely, but they do to the extent of disagreeing with the Christian worldview. Of course, Muslims don't believe Jesus himself was actually crucified, nor, of course, resurrected, but they do believe he was a prophet of some sort. Now, what is your response to the Islamic perspective of Jesus?
Yeah, so the Quran mentions Jesus, I think, 25 times, which actually is more times than it mentions Muhammad. I think it only mentions Muhammad 3 times, if I recall. And the Quran, of course, is quite clear that Jesus is not God. That's very clear. Surah 5, verse 116, for instance, and other texts. The Quran is also clear that Jesus did not die by crucifixion. That's in Surah 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 157 and 158. And in the space of 40 Arabic words, the Quran denies that Jesus was crucified. The Quran says that in reference to the Jews, they said, "In boast, we slew the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, but they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but they were deluded by resemblance. And those who differ in the matter are surely in doubt about it, but of a certainty they did not kill him." First of all, it's interesting that the text says that the Jews said in boast, "We slew the Messiah." What Jew is going to say in boast, "We slew our Messiah," right? That seems very implausible. And the Quran, the common classical interpretation of what the Quran is saying in Surah 4, verse 157, when it says they were deluded by resemblance, is that someone was made to resemble Jesus and put on the cross in his stead, right? And so that's the way that they attempt to explain all the evidence that tends to point to Jesus actually being crucified. They say, well, it looked like Jesus was crucified, but someone was made to look like Jesus and crucified by mistake.
Perhaps like a body swap.
Right, exactly. There was exactly a body swap. Poor guy. Might have been Judas Iscariot, or perhaps Simon of Cyrene, right, or something like that. There are also a minority of Muslims that take the swin theory, which is that Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die by crucifixion. So Shabir Ali, for instance, will take that view. And also the Ahmadiyya Muslims, which is a minority Muslim sect, also believe in the swin theory. And most Muslims, though, don't consider the Ahmadiyya to be Muslims. Kind of the same sort of relationship that Christians would have with Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or something like
right.
That. Yeah. But how do I respond then to that? Well, I think this brings me to what I would call the crucifixion dilemma, which is to say that I think there's strong historiographical evidence that Jesus actually predicted ahead of time his impending death by crucifixion and his resurrection from the dead. If that is the case, then one of two things is true. Either he was crucified, in which case the Quran's wrong in Surah 4, verse 157, or he wasn't crucified, in which case he's a false prophet, in which case the Quran's also wrong. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Catch-22 situation. And in terms of evidence that Jesus actually did predict this ahead of time, so I already mentioned earlier the undesigned coincidence and extra biblical support relating to Jesus' statement in John 2, verses 18 and 19, when the Jews have asked Jesus, "What miraculous sign do you show us to prove your authority to do these things?" And Jesus says, "He'll destroy this temple, rebuild it in 3 days." And we looked at an undesigned coincidence with Mark 14, 57, 58. And we also looked at the extra biblical confirmation relating to the 46 years it's taken to build the temple. Another example would be in Mark 8. Mark 8 and verse 31 and following says, "It began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" So here you have this double rebuke. Peter rebukes Jesus and Jesus rebukes Peter, calling him Satan or adversary. Now, is this the sort of thing that you would expect? I mean, the patristic sources tell us that Mark's source was the Apostle Peter, which is plausible. Now, is this the sort of thing you would expect Mark to come up with if this had not in fact happened in the way that Mark says, where Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," to the Apostle Peter. It seems unlikely. It does provide evidence that this is probably historical. Another example would be in John chapter 18, where where Jesus is being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Peter takes his sword to strike off the ear of the high priest's servant, and the high priest's servant's name is Malchus, John tells us. And it says that Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And so the cup, of course, is an image from the Old Testament. Psalm 75, for instance, talks about the cup of God's fury. And the idea is that the nations are to drink this cup, which represents the wrath and the judgment of God. But of course, the New Testament theology is that Christ takes that cup and he drinks it himself. And so he uses this metaphor of the cup to describe his sufferings on the cross. He says, "Put your sword into a sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, interestingly, John's gospel nowhere else uses the imagery of the cup to describe Jesus' sufferings. So why does he use the imagery of the cup here? Well, if you look at the synoptic gospels, we learn that Jesus had just been praying that night in those very terms, asking, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nonetheless, not as I will, but as you will." And so the synoptics report that Jesus was praying that night in these very terms. John reports the statement, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me," upon his arrest, but doesn't report that Jesus had been praying that night in those very terms. And so the two accounts fit together in a very casual and artless way that tends to support historicity, and therefore support that Jesus actually did predict ahead of time his impending death by crucifixion and his subsequent resurrection from the dead. And so again, either if Jesus was crucified, then it contradicts the Quran, so Islam's wrong. Or if he was not crucified, then he's a false prophet, which makes the Quran also wrong. So that would be my argument there.
Yeah, no, I'm still not convinced of the Islamic perspective, to be honest, because I've talked to Hamza's sources, and
I watched it. Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think one of the fundamental parts of what he said throughout that discussion, I really was not convinced of the when he was talking about, well, we can't trust history, and because it felt, I know it's not his area, and that's fair enough and understandable, but it did feel like a half-baked sort of counter argument, and it's kind of surprising because it's such a pillar, of Islam, and for to hear that response, it was kind of jarring, because I was kind of left wanting more. I was left wanting more of a convincing counter argument, because, as you say, look, regardless of how skeptical I might be of the Old Testament and the prophecies and so on, it's quite clear, though, that there are reasons to believe that it was prophesied, and that there was context behind the resurrection. It wasn't this isolated event. Actually, it was quite a few things coming together that fundamentally make it the event that it was.
Right.
And it feels like the Quran, and this is probably my biggest issue with Islam. It just feels like the Quran was saying, "Look, trust me, bro." Right. and I just find that to be such a big issue. I can't get over that,
Right. I completely agree. And the crucifixion is in our earliest strata of early Christian records. I mean, you find it, for instance, in Philippians 2:5-11, that scholars call the Carmen Christi, which is a lot of scholars think it's an ancient Christian hymn, where it says that our attitude should be like that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped at all costs, but humbled himself, taking upon himself the form of a man, and be found, or the form of a servant, being found in human likeness, and becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. I mean, most scholars think that is a hymn that predates Paul's own composition. So that's an early source. Also, 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, which, of course, we've alluded to previously, mentions the crucifixion, that what I received I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and so forth. And of course, in verse 11, of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul alluding to the other apostles. He says, whether then it was I or they, so we preached and so you believed. And so he thus assumes that the Corinthians understand what he's saying concerning the resurrection and the crucifixion to be in alignment with what the other apostles have been preaching. And we know independently that the Corinthians were acquainted with the preaching of Peter, because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, I follow Cephas, others Apollos, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. So the Corinthians were acquainted with Peter's preaching, and Paul seems to imply that the other apostles, including Peter, had already preached this message concerning the cross, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So it's very difficult to get around the evidence that we have in the New Testament.
Yeah, it does. Again, I'm agnostic atheist, but it really does feel like Christianity has the upper hand in its historicity to me.
Right.
But yeah, anyway, I think I picked your brain enough for today. Thank you so much for coming on. It was really, it was really interesting, in depth, and I'm gonna have to rewatch this a few times just to try and, just to try and kind of take it all in and to think more about it, because you've given me a lot of food for thought.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. Must do it again sometime.
Yeah. Well, I originally had, of course, some other bonus questions, and like we rightly agreed, it's probably better to keep it to the subject. But yeah, thanks again for coming on, and hopefully I'll see you soon.